It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Brandon Bishop laughed as he flicked a glob of blue oil paint onto Victoria Bishop's vintage silk blouse in the center of the crowded gallery. The wet, cobalt smear bloomed across the cream fabric like a bruise. Around them, the elite of the city's art scene paused, champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. The air in the room, thick with the scent of fresh varnish and expensive lilies, seemed to turn brittle. "Oh, Vicky," he said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room. He didn't look sorry. Instead, he adjusted the sleeve of his tailored Italian suit, a suit Victoria knew had been paid for by the marketing stipend she'd authorized last month. "You always did have a knack for looking like a charcoal sketch in a room full of masterpieces. I'm just adding a little color to your drab existence." Beside him, Isabella Martinez giggled, the sound like breaking glass. She leaned into him, her hand, sporting a diamond tennis bracelet that had definitely not come from her consultant's salary, resting possessively on his arm. "Don't be mean, Brandon," she purred, though her eyes were sharp with triumph. "She probably spent weeks picking out that blouse from a thrift store rack. It's not like she is anywhere important to be anyway." Victoria didn't flinch. She felt the damp tackiness of the paint seeping through the silk, cold against her skin, but she remained as still as the marble bust of a stoic philosopher behind her. She watched her husband, noting the flush of alcohol in his cheeks and the jagged, arrogant edge to his smile. He was performing for the crowd, playing the role of the charismatic benefactor, while she was cast as the dowdy, lucky wife who lived in his shadow. "It's a shame, really," Lisa Bishop added, gliding into the circle with the practiced grace of a predator. The matriarch of the family looked every bit the old money icon she pretended to be, her neck draped in pearls that Victoria had personally rescued from a high-end pawn shop 3 years ago to save the family's public image. She didn't look at the ruin of her daughter-in-law's shirt. She looked through her. "Appearance is everything at an opening like this, Victoria. If you can't represent the Bishop name with a bit of dignity, perhaps you should have stayed in the basement with your blueprints. You're embarrassing Brandon in front of the board." A ripple of snickering moved through the witnesses. Lisa's enablers, a trio of socialites in matching designer masks, nodded in synchronized disdain. They saw a woman who worked too hard and dressed too simply. They didn't see the woman who signed their husbands' consulting checks. "I'll remember that, Lisa," Victoria said quietly. Her voice was a low, steady contrast to the frantic, high-pitched energy of the room. She didn't reach for a napkin. She didn't try to scrub the stain. She simply stood her ground, her eyes memorizing every face that turned away in mockery. Brandon rolled his eyes, turning back to the centerpiece of the exhibit, a massive abstract canvas of jagged reds and blacks. "Anyway, enough about the help. This piece is the crown jewel of my latest acquisition strategy. It's bold. It's expensive. It's everything you aren't, Vicky. I'm thinking of putting it in the main lobby of the firm. It needs a space that commands respect." He began to regale the group with a story of his shrewd negotiations to secure the gallery's lease, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He had no idea that the man he'd spoken to, the mysterious Z Capital representative he had groveled to for weeks, reported directly to the woman standing 3 feet away with a ruined shirt. He didn't know that the very floor he stood on was owned by a holding company that Victoria had built while he was busy networking at golf clubs. Victoria felt her phone buzz in her clutch. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Marcus Thorne. The final audit of the Bishop brand ambassador accounts was complete. The embezzlement wasn't just a few thousand. Brandon had been bleeding the architectural firm's reserve funds to buy Isabella's affection and his mother's lifestyle for nearly 18 months. He had played her for a fool, thinking her silence was a sign of weakness rather than a strategy of containment. She stepped back, the click of her modest heels echoing with a hollow finality on the polished concrete floor. She looked at the painting Brandon was so proud of. It was a chaotic mess of ego and wasted potential, much like him. "You're right, Brandon," she said, her voice cutting through his boastful narrative. "It is a very expensive piece, I hope you enjoyed the view today. It's a very specific kind of art, the kind that looks different when the lights go out." He squinted at her, his brows furrowing in a rare moment of genuine confusion. The alcohol made his reactions sluggish. "What is that supposed to mean? You're acting weirder than usual." "It means that art is all about timing," Victoria replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth edge of an encrypted thumb drive. "And your time is up. I think I've seen enough." She turned her back on them before he could respond. She could feel their eyes on her, some pitying, some mocking, but mostly she felt the weight of the secret she carried. As she walked toward the exit, she passed the gallery director, who gave her a subtle, terrified nod. The man knew who actually signed the lease. She stepped out into the cool evening air, the smell of rain and exhaust replacing the cloying floral scent of the gallery. A black sedan was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the twilight. The door opened before she reached it, and the silhouette of Marcus Thorne became visible in the back seat, his laptop glowing in the dark. "Is it done?" he asked as she slid into the leather interior. Victoria looked down at the blue stain on her chest. It was the last thing Brandon would ever take from her. "The audit is finished," she said, her voice as cold as the marble in the gallery. "I want the eviction notices for the penthouse served by morning. And Marcus, tell the gallery director that the bishop's acquisition of this space was never finalized. I'm pulling the funding, effective immediately. And your husband." Victoria watched the lights of the gallery fade in the rearview mirror as the car pulled away. "Let him keep the painting. He's going to need something to look at when he's sitting in a room with 4 white walls and no furniture. He wanted color. I'm about to show him the entire spectrum of a total collapse." She leaned back, the silence of the car a welcome sanctuary. The rage that had been a slow-burning ember for years finally caught flame, but it wasn't wild. It was a controlled, surgical heat. "2 days until the board meeting," she whispered to the dark. "Let's see how well he handles a room he doesn't own." The scent of dark-roasted Arabica coffee drifted through the sun-drenched penthouse, a smell that usually signaled a peaceful morning. But as Victoria Bishop stepped into the dining room, the aroma was drowned out by the sharp, chemical tang of Isabella's expensive hairspray. Brandon sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silk robe thrown open with a carelessness that suggested he owned the very air he breathed. Across from him, Isabella Martinez was already draped in one of Victoria's cashmere throws, sipping from a crystal flute of mimosa. Lisa Bishop sat to his right, her posture regal as she inspected her manicure with a look of profound boredom. "There she is," Brandon said, his voice thick with a mock-jovial tone that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't look up from his tablet. "I was beginning to think you decided to hide in the guest wing forever after your little performance last night." Victoria pulled out a chair at the far end of the table. The heavy silver spoon beside her plate felt cold against her thumb, a solid anchor in a room full of ghosts. "I have work to do, Brandon. Unlike some people in this room, my day doesn't start with champagne." Lisa let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Work? You mean that little boutique firm you play around with? Brandon is out there securing the Bishop legacy, Victoria. You should be thanking him for providing this roof over your head, especially after the way you embarrassed us at the gallery." "The gallery was a mess because the funding was unstable," Victoria replied calmly, her eyes fixed on her husband. "I told you months ago that the acquisition wasn't vetted." Brandon finally looked up, the metallic click of his gold lighter punctuating his annoyance as he lit a cigarette, a habit Victoria had forbidden in the house years ago. He blew a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling, his expression one of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "The funding is fine. I'm the face of the Bishop Group, Victoria. People invest in me. They invest in the name. Isabella here has already secured 3 new curators for the spring show. While you were busy sulking in the car, we were making moves." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "In fact, since you're clearly struggling with your moods, I've decided Isabella will be staying here for a few weeks. She needs to be close to the office to coordinate the transition." The audacity of the statement hung in the air like the smoke from his cigarette. Isabella offered a small, predatory smile over the rim of her glass. "The master suite has much better lighting for my morning meetings, Victoria. I'm sure you won't mind moving your things to the smaller room down the hall. It's more your size." Victoria felt the familiar heat of rage prickling at the back of her neck, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she reached into her silk robe and felt the small, rectangular weight of her phone. A vibration buzzed against her skin. Served, the message from Marcus Thorne Reed. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 9:02 a.m. "You're right, Brandon," she said, her voice dropping to a level of terrifying silkiness. "The Bishop name is very important. It's a shame you've forgotten who actually built the foundation it stands on." "Oh, please," Lisa snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "You were a scholarship student with a few blueprints when Brandon found you. Everything you have, this penthouse, the cars, the accounts, it all comes from the Bishop family coffers." Victoria took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness of the roast a perfect match for the moment. "Is that what you told the bank when you took out that bridge loan for your summer estate, Lisa? That it was Bishop money?" Lisa's face went pale, the rouge on her cheeks suddenly looking like bruised fruit. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. And Brandon, I think you'll find that the investors you've been charming aren't as loyal as you think." Victoria stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetted blade. "The board meeting is in 48 hours. I'd suggest you spend that time looking for a very good moving company." Brandon barked a laugh, leaning back and spreading his arms wide. "Moving? I'm not going anywhere. I own this floor. I own the building. I own you, Victoria. If anyone is leaving, it's the person who can't even afford the maintenance fees on her own shoes." He reached out to pat Isabella's hand, his arrogance so thick it was almost suffocating. He truly believed the lie he'd been living. He didn't know that the holding company, VB International, which held the deeds to every property he touched, was named for her. He didn't know that the anonymous donor who had kept his failing firm afloat for 3 years was the wife he treated like a servant. The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent chime that cut through the tension. "That'll be my new golf clubs," Brandon said, smirking at Victoria. "Go be a good girl and tell the concierge to bring them up." Victoria didn't move. She simply watched him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I don't think those are golf clubs, Brandon." The chime rang again, followed by a heavy knock. It wasn't the concierge's polite rap. It was the sound of authority. "What are you waiting for?" Lisa hissed. "Answer the door, Victoria." "No," Victoria said, her voice echoing in the vast, expensive silence of the room. "I think Brandon should answer this one. It's a delivery he's been earning for a long time." Brandon scowled, shoving himself away from the table. "Fine, I'll do it myself. But when I get back, I want your bags packed." He marched toward the foyer, his silk robe billowing behind him like a tattered flag. Victoria turned back to the table, meeting Isabella's confused gaze. She picked up the silver spoon again, turning it over in her hand. The countdown had reached 0. As Brandon pulled open the heavy oak door, the sound of a formal voice drifted back into the dining room. "Brandon Bishop, you've been served. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Victoria had heard in years. The heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound final and cold, like a judge's gavel. Brandon stared at the legal document in his hand, his knuckles white against the crisp, expensive parchment. The silence in the dining room was thick, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of his mother. Lisa stood frozen, her hand clutching the back of her chair so hard the wood groaned. Brandon's face shifted from a mask of shock to one of blistering, ugly rage. He didn't look at the paper anymore. He looked at Victoria. He didn't see the woman who had funded his lifestyle for a decade. He saw an obstacle. With a sudden, violent motion, he crumpled the eviction notice into a jagged ball and hurled it at her. It bounced off her shoulder and fell into her soup, bobbing in the cream like a sinking ship. "You think this is real?" Brandon's voice was a low, dangerous snarl. "You think some bottom-feeding process server can kick me out of my own house? I am the face of this family. I am the brand. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the mess in her bowl. She simply picked up her linen napkin and wiped a microscopic drop of broth from her wrist. The smell of the truffle oil in the soup felt cloying now, a scent of rot disguised as luxury. "It isn't your house, Brandon," she said, her voice like a calm current beneath a frozen lake. "It never was. You were just a guest who overstayed his welcome." Lisa finally found her voice, though it was shrill and thin. "Victoria, stop this madness. Think of the optics. If the neighbors see moving trucks, our standing in the Heights is finished. I have a luncheon with the Historical Society tomorrow. You're being hysterical." "I've never been more lucid, Lisa," Victoria replied, standing up. She didn't wait for their response. She walked toward the foyer, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. Behind her, she heard Brandon shouting for his lawyer, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings he couldn't afford to heat. An hour later, Victoria sat in the back of a sleek, black sedan. The city blurred past the window in a smear of neon and rain. She pulled a burner phone from her coat pocket and dialed a number she knew by heart. "It's done," she said when the line picked up. "He's served, but he's not going to leave quietly." "He doesn't have a choice," Marcus Thorne replied, his voice a deep, reassuring rumble. "The ownership is ironclad, Victoria. I'm looking at the original deed right now. The Bishop Trust was never his. He was just the signature on the letterhead. I have the secondary documents ready for the gala. The embezzlement trail is wider than we thought." "He wasn't just skimming, he was hemorrhaging your capital into Isabella's art accounts." "I want the final signatures by tomorrow morning," Victoria said, watching her reflection in the glass. She looked different tonight. The softness was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory edge. "I want him to feel like he still has a chance. Let him call his contacts. Let him scramble." "He's already doing it," Marcus said. "My office just got a frantic call from his firm. They're trying to file an injunction. It'll be dead on arrival, but it'll give him the false confidence he needs to show up at the event." "Good," she whispered. "The higher he climbs, the more air he'll lose when the floor vanishes." She ended the call as the car pulled up to a nondescript office building on the edge of the financial district. This was her true sanctuary, the headquarters of a firm Brandon didn't even know existed, the silent engine that actually drove the Bishop empire. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and expensive leather. Victoria walked into the conference room where Marcus waited. He didn't offer a platitude or a drink. He simply laid out a series of folders on the mahogany table. Each one was a nail in Brandon's professional coffin. "This is the one you wanted," Marcus said, sliding a blue folder toward her. Victoria opened it. Inside was a single, notarized document. It was the termination of the brand ambassadorship, effective immediately, along with a personal guarantee of debt that Brandon had signed 3 years ago while drunk on his own perceived invincibility. He had put up his entire personal reputation and future earnings as collateral for a loan he'd used to buy Isabella a villa in Tuscany. She felt a cold surge of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the total erasure of the man who had tried to erase her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. "Don't bother coming back tonight. I've changed the codes. I'm selling your jewelry in the morning to pay for the legal fees you're costing me. You're nothing without my name, Victoria. Go back to the gutter where I found you." She stared at the screen, a small, dark smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She could hear Isabella's high, mocking laughter in the subtext of the message. They were probably in the master suite right now, drinking her vintage Bordeaux, celebrating a victory that didn't exist. "Is everything all right?" Marcus asked, noticing her expression. "Everything is perfect," Victoria said, sliding the blue folder into her bag. "He thinks he's locked me out. He thinks he's won." She looked at the clock on the wall. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. "Marcus, ensure the security team is at the house by 8:00 a.m. I want the locks changed back while he's at his morning fitting for the gala. And make sure Isabella's belongings are packed in industrial trash bags, not the expensive ones, the thin, gray ones that tear easily." "Consider it done," Marcus replied. Victoria walked to the window, looking out at the skyline. Somewhere out there, Brandon was making plans for a future that had already been deleted. He was picking out a tuxedo, preparing a speech, and dreaming of power. He had no idea that the sleeping lion hadn't just woken up. She had already started the hunt. 2 days, she murmured, the cold glass of the window chilling her fingertips. In 48 hours, the bishop name will finally mean something again, and he won't be the one wearing it. The city lights flickered, a storm rolling in from the coast. The wind began to howl against the reinforced glass, a low, mourning sound that felt like an overture. Victoria closed her eyes, savoring the weight of the evidence in her purse. The weapon was loaded. All that remained was the gala and the final, public pull of the trigger. The sun hit the crystal chandeliers of the Bishop estate with a blinding, artificial brilliance. The air inside the grand drawing room smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, acidic tang of Lisa Bishop's favorite imported espresso. In the center of the room, Brandon Bishop stood on a velvet pedestal, his arms outstretched as an elderly tailor pinned the sleeves of a midnight blue tuxedo. "Careful with the silk," Brandon snapped, his voice echoing off the high, coffered ceilings. He looked down at the tailor with a sneer that made the man's hands tremble. "That fabric costs more than your entire shop. If you snag it, you're paying for the whole bolt." Isabella Martinez sat on the nearby silk sofa, swirling a mimosa and scrolling through a tablet. She giggled, her eyes raking over Brandon with a hunger that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the lifestyle he provided. "You look like a king, Brandon. The gala tomorrow isn't just a party, it's your coronation. The Bishop name is finally going to be synonymous with power again." Victoria Bishop entered the room quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. She didn't need a pedestal to be seen, though the others barely acknowledged her arrival. She watched the display with a detachment that felt like ice. She noticed the way Lisa leaned over a mahogany desk, obsessing over the seating chart for the gala, her pearls clacking against each other as she moved. "You should check the structural integrity of that suit, Brandon," Victoria said, her voice a calm ripple in the room's frantic energy. "Sometimes when the foundation is built on borrowed sand, the whole thing tends to collapse under the slightest pressure." Brandon snorted, checking his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. He adjusted his cufflinks, his ego radiating off him in waves. "Architecture talk again, Victoria. This is why you're the worker bee and I'm the face of the brand. You worry about the dirt and the foundations. I'll worry about the gold and the glory. Tomorrow night, I'm announcing the international expansion. The Bishop legacy is mine now." Lisa looked up from her list, her eyes narrowing as she adjusted her glasses. "Victoria, don't be a killjoy. Tomorrow is the pinnacle of this family's rebirth. Brandon has secured our future. You should be thanking him for keeping the name relevant while you hide in your drafting office. He's the one out there doing the real work." Victoria felt the cold weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a small, silver anchor. She caught the eye of the tailor, Mr. Henderson, who had dressed her father for 30 years. He stopped pinning for a second, his eyes meeting Victoria's. He saw it, the shift in her posture, the terrifying stillness in her gaze. He had seen that same look in her father's eyes right before he closed a deal that would ruin a competitor. The tailor quickly looked down, a small, knowing shiver passing through him. Brandon stepped off the pedestal and brushed past Victoria, intentionally bumping her shoulder. The smell of his expensive, musky cologne was suffocating. "Enjoy the view from the back of the room tomorrow, Vic," he whispered, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "Because after the gala, I'm signing the papers to sell the firm's holding assets. I've already got the buyers lined up. You'll be looking for a new job by Monday morning. I'm done carrying your dead weight." He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward Isabella, laughing as she pulled him into a kiss. They were a portrait of stolen wealth and unearned confidence. Later that evening, the storm from the coast finally arrived, lashing against the windows of Victoria's private study. The wind howled, a low, mourning sound that felt like an overture to the coming destruction. Marcus Thorne stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers reflecting in his glasses as he sipped a glass of amber scotch. "The injunctions are signed and sealed," Marcus said, his voice low and professional. "The media packets are encrypted and ready for release the moment you give the signal at the gala tomorrow night. Every news outlet in the city will have the embezzlement records and the true ownership documents simultaneously." Victoria looked at the countdown on her phone. 20 hours. She touched the cold glass of the window, watching a lightning bolt split the dark sky over the city skyline. "He thinks he's selling the firm tomorrow," she murmured, her reflection in the glass looking like a stranger's, sharper, colder, and entirely unrecognizable to the family that had spent years dismissing her. "He can't sell what he doesn't own," Marcus replied, setting his glass down with a definitive click. "He's spent 5 years building a house of cards. He has no idea you've been holding the fan the entire time." Victoria closed her eyes, the sound of the rain turning into the rhythm of a closing trap. The warning had been given, and as expected, it had been ignored. Brandon was preparing for a coronation, unaware that the throne he was about to sit on had already been dismantled. Tomorrow, the Bishop name wouldn't just mean something again. It would finally be hers. The scent of white lilies was so thick in the penthouse it felt like a physical weight, a cloying, floral shroud that masked the smell of overpriced gin and desperation. Victoria Bishop stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a crystal flute. The glass was chilled, the condensation a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the crowded room. Below, the city lights flickered like dying embers, but up here, under the gold-leafed ceilings of the Bishop Global Headquarters, everything was blindingly bright. She watched the reflection of the room in the dark glass. Brandon Bishop was at the center of a semicircle of investors, his laughter booming, too loud and too frequent. He looked every bit the conqueror in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than the annual salary of the janitors currently buffing the lobby floors 40 stories below. "Victoria, darling, don't just stand there like a gargoyle," Lisa Bishop said, gliding toward her with a predatory grace. She adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet, the stones catching the light with a cold, artificial fire. "It's a celebration. Try to look at least marginally grateful that your brother is saving what's left of our reputation." Victoria didn't turn. She didn't have to. She could hear the familiar condescension in her mother's voice, the way it sharpened whenever they were in public. "Saving it or selling it?" Lisa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "In this world, they're the same thing. Now go find Isabella. Her hem is dragging and the photographers will be here in 10 minutes. Make yourself useful for once." The first rage spike hit Victoria not as a heat, but as a sudden, clarifying cold. Her mother wasn't asking. She was issuing an order to a servant she happened to share DNA with. Victoria took a slow sip of the vintage champagne. It tasted of ash. She moved through the crowd, a ghost in a sea of silk and ego. She found Isabella Martinez near the grand piano, draped in a gown of shimmering emerald that screamed for attention. Around her neck sat a vintage Bulgari necklace, a piece Victoria recognized instantly. It had belonged to her grandmother, a piece that was supposed to be kept in the family vault until Victoria's wedding day. "Oh, Victoria," Isabella said, her voice a melodic trill that made Victoria's skin crawl. She leaned in, the scent of her heavy, musk-based perfume clashing violently with the lilies. "Brandon gave me this tonight. He said it was wasted sitting in a dark box. It looks much better on me, don't you think? It actually matches my eyes." "It matches the embezzlement," Victoria thought, but she merely offered a thin, practiced smile. "It's certainly a statement," Victoria said aloud. Isabella laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound. "Brandon said you'd be jealous. He told me you'd probably try to claim it was yours. But really, sweetie, look at you. That dress is 3 seasons old. You're lucky he even let you through the front door tonight." Victoria felt the weight of the small, encrypted drive in her clutch. It was no larger than a thumb, but it contained the digital trail of every cent Brandon had funneled into Isabella's art consultancy over the last 18 months. It was the weight of a mountain, and she was about to drop it. "I'm just glad you're enjoying it, Isabella," Victoria said softly. While it lasts. She turned and saw Marcus Thorne standing near the entrance to the private boardroom. He was the only person in the room who didn't look like he was performing for an audience. When their eyes met, he gave a single, imperceptible nod. The guests were all here. The buyers, the real ones, not the puppets Brandon had been whining and dining, were waiting behind those double mahogany doors. Brandon Bishop broke away from his circle of sycophants and approached Victoria, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that only comes from believing you've already won. He grabbed a fresh drink from a passing tray and didn't bother to offer her one. 10 minutes, Vicky, he hissed, leaning close so the investors couldn't hear. 10 minutes until I sign the papers and this whole crumbling empire becomes someone else's problem. I've already booked the villa in Tuscany for the next 6 months. You, on the other hand, might want to start looking at studio apartments in the suburbs. I checked the trust. There's barely enough left to cover your phone bill once I'm done. You seem very sure of the numbers, Brandon, she replied, her voice steady. I'm sure of the only number that matters, he sneered, gesturing to the room. The one on the check. Now stay out of the way. If you say one word to the board members, I'll have security escort you out to the curb before the ink is dry. You're a liability, and tonight, I'm finally liquidating you. He clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture that looked affectionate to the room but felt like a threat. Victoria watched him walk toward the boardroom, his stride full of unearned confidence. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, admiring the view of the ceiling. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Marcus. The auditors from the buying firm are already inside, Marcus whispered. They've seen the preliminary discrepancies I sent over an hour ago. Brandon thinks he's going in there to sign a bill of sale. He has no idea they're actually there to serve him with a forensic freeze. And the board? Victoria asked. They're terrified, Marcus said, a grim smile touching his lips. They realized 10 minutes ago that if Brandon signs that deal, they're all liable for the missing $40 million. They're looking for a savior, Victoria, and they're about to find out you're the only one who holds the keys to the kingdom. Victoria looked back at the room, at Lisa preening for a socialite, at Isabella stroking the stolen necklace, and at Brandon, who was currently pausing at the boardroom doors to adjust his tie in the reflection of the polished wood. The anticipation was a low hum in her bones, a countdown clock that was finally reaching 0. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play she had written months ago finally reach its climax. Brandon turned and caught her eye one last time. He winked, a final mocking salute to the sister he thought he had broken. Then, with a flourish, he pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, followed by his legal team and the primary investors. Victoria waited. She counted to 10, feeling the rhythm of her own heart, slow and deliberate. "Shall we?" Marcus asked, offering his arm. Victoria didn't take it. She stood tall, smoothing the front of her 3-season-old dress, which was actually a custom piece she'd commissioned under her own holding company's name. "Not yet," Victoria said, her voice ringing with a new, terrifying authority. "I want him to sit down first. I want him to pick up the pen. I want him to feel the exact moment the world stops spinning for him." She started toward the doors, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like a series of small, sharp gunshots. The party continued behind her, the guests oblivious to the fact that the floor was about to fall out from under the Bishop name. She reached the mahogany doors and paused, her hand hovering over the brass handle. From inside, she heard the muffled sound of Brandon's voice, booming with false bravado. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. Let's make history, shall we?" Victoria pushed the doors open. Victoria Bishop stood in the threshold of the boardroom, the heavy mahogany doors still vibrating from the force of her entrance. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sterile ozone of a running projector. At the head of the long table, Brandon Bishop froze, his hand hovering inches above a contract that would have finalized the sale of the Bishop Global flagship property. "Victoria," he stammered, his bravado flickering like a dying candle. He tried to recover quickly, his face twisting into a familiar mask of condescension. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting for the board and the executive team. You're making a scene, and quite frankly, you're embarrassing yourself." Beside him, Isabella Martinez let out a sharp, mocking titter, smoothing her silk skirt with manicured fingers. "Darling, the kitchen is 2 floors down if you're looking for the catering staff," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Victoria didn't flinch. She walked toward the table, the sharp, rhythmic strike of her heels sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. She could feel the weight of the encrypted drive in her palm, a small piece of hardware that held the power to dismantle a decade of Brandon's lies. Marcus Thorne followed a step behind her, his expression a wall of professional ice. "Sit down, Brandon," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonance that silenced the murmurs of the gathered board members. "I will not be told what to do in my own boardroom," Brandon shouted, his face reddening as he looked toward the security detail near the door. "Get her out of here, now." "Actually," Marcus Thorne interrupted, placing a single, silver-embossed folder on the table, "this isn't your boardroom, and according to the updated registry from the Secretary of State, you aren't the CEO of anything." The room went deathly silent. Lisa Bishop, who had been watching from a plush chair in the corner, stood up, her hand clutching her throat. "Marcus, don't be absurd. My son is the heir to the Bishop legacy. Victoria is just a beneficiary." Victoria reached the head of the table and leaned over, pressing the USB drive into the console. "I'm not a beneficiary, Lisa. I'm the architect, in every sense of the word." She tapped a command on the touchscreen. The projector, which had been displaying Brandon's inflated quarterly projections, flickered and died. A moment later, it roared back to life, displaying a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and the unmistakable digital signature of the Bishop Global master key, an administrative override Brandon thought he alone possessed. The transformation in Brandon's expression was visceral. His skin, usually a mask of bronze arrogance, drained of color until it matched the bone-white documents on the table. His eyes widened, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as they scanned the digital signatures that bypassed his authority. A fine tremor started in his right hand, causing the fountain pen to rattle against the mahogany like a frantic heartbeat. His mouth hung open, his tongue visible and dry, while a single, heavy drop of perspiration escaped his temple and vanished into the collar of his $4,000 suit. He looked suddenly, profoundly small, as if the very air had been sucked out of his lungs, leaving him a hollowed-out shell of the man who had entered the room. "What is this?" one of the board members, a gray-haired man named Mr. Sterling, demanded as he leaned forward. "These accounts there in Victoria's name, all of them. The holding company, the intellectual property, even the land deeds." Isabella's face went from smug to ghostly pale in seconds. She looked at the screen, then at the designer bag on her lap, bought with funds the screen now proved were stolen. She pulled her chair back, the legs screeching against the marble floor as she instinctively tried to distance herself from the man at the head of the table. "It's a lie," Brandon finally choked out, though his voice lacked any conviction. "She's hacked the system. She's trying to frame me." "The system was never yours to begin with, Brandon," Victoria said, her gaze steady and cold. "You spent 5 years treating my inheritance like a personal ATM while you mocked my 3-season-old dresses and my lack of ambition. You thought I was hiding because I was weak. I was hiding because I was waiting for you to steal enough to make the charges federal." She turned to the board, her presence commanding every eye in the room. "The contracts you were about to sign are void. The man sitting in that chair has no authority to bind this company to any agreement. As of 10 minutes ago, the board of directors has been dissolved and replaced by the trustees of the VB endowment." Lisa Bishop stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Victoria, please, we're family. Think about the scandal. Think about the Bishop name." "I am thinking about it," Victoria replied, picking up the fountain pen Brandon had dropped. "I'm thinking about how much better it looks without you attached to it." She turned to Marcus. "The authorities are waiting in the lobby. With the warrants," Marcus confirmed, checking his watch. And the forensic accountants. Victoria looked back at Brandon, who was staring at the screen as if he could wish the data away. He looked up at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. "You said I didn't belong in a room like this," she said, her voice a whisper that carried like a winter wind. "You were right. I don't belong in a room full of thieves. That's why I'm taking the room with me." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the doors wide open. Behind her, the room erupted into a chaos of shouting voices and the frantic sound of chairs being pushed back, but she didn't look back. She had a new office to move into, and the locks were already being changed. Victoria stood in the center of the atrium, the scent of industrial lavender cleaner clashing with the heavy, musky cologne Brandon had sprayed too liberally that morning. The glass walls of the Bishop Mercer headquarters felt like a prism, catching the flashing blue lights of the vehicles parked at the curb. She felt remarkably still, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy erupting from the elevators behind her. Brandon burst through the doors, his silk tie loosened and his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He wasn't alone. Lisa Bishop followed close behind, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the marble. Isabella Martinez trailed them, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a designer handbag as if it were a life raft. "You think this is it?" Brandon shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high ceiling. He stopped 5 feet from Victoria, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You think some fake spreadsheets and a few disgruntled accountants can take me down? I built this brand. I am the face of this company." Victoria didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the cuff of her modest wool coat, her eyes moving to Marcus Thorne, who stepped out from the shadows of the reception desk. He held a thick stack of documents, the official seal of the district attorney's office visible even from a distance. "Actually, Brandon," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "The forensic team didn't just find spreadsheets. They found the offshore accounts you opened in Isabella's name. They found the consulting fees paid to your mother for services that never existed. And most importantly, they found the digital footprint of the wire transfers you authorized from the pension fund." The color didn't just leave Brandon's face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a sickly, grayish pallor that made him look a decade older in seconds. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch he couldn't control. His eyes, once bright with the fire of unearned arrogance, went flat and glassy, darting frantically from the warrants in the officer's hands to the cold, unblinking lenses of the security cameras he had once used to monitor his staff. He looked like a man watching his own execution in slow motion, his nostrils flaring as he struggled to pull air into lungs that seemed to have forgotten how to function under the weight of his own crumbling empire. His knees buckled slightly, and for a moment it looked like he might collapse right there on the polished stone floor. "Offshore accounts," Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers tangling in the heavy gold necklace Victoria had paid for 3 Christmases ago. She turned to her son, the mask of the old money matriarch finally shattering. "Brandon, you said that money was from your bonuses. You said Victoria was the one draining the company." "He lied to all of us, Lisa," Isabella whispered, stepping away from Brandon as if his failure were contagious. She looked at Victoria, her expression shifting from arrogance to a desperate, nauseating plea for mercy. "Victoria, I didn't know. He told me it was legal. He said you were okay with it. I can help you. I can tell them everything he did." Victoria finally looked at the woman who had spent the last year mocking her lack of style at every charity gala. "You were happy enough to spend the money when it was buying you art, Isabella. Your cooperation isn't needed. The paper trail is a mile long." Brandon tried to step toward her, but a uniformed officer placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest noise in the room. It was a sharp, metallic finality that seemed to vibrate in Victoria's very bones. "This is a mistake," Brandon whimpered, the bravado gone, replaced by the high-pitched whine of a cornered animal. "Victoria, please, we're family. We can fix this. I'll give it all back. Just tell them to stop." Victoria walked closer to him, stopping only when she could see the sweat beading on his forehead. She could smell the sour scent of fear on him now, a pungent human smell that no amount of designer fragrance could mask. "You told me I was lucky to even be in the same room as you," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "You told me I was a ghost in my own company, but you forgot one thing about ghosts, Brandon. We see everything, and we never, ever forget." She turned to Marcus. "The board has already voted." "Unanimously," Marcus confirmed. "The dissolution of the partnership is finalized. The bishop name is being stripped from the building by morning. You are the sole remaining director." Lisa let out a choked sob, reaching out to grab Victoria's arm. Victoria stepped back, her movement fluid and cold. "I'm sorry, Lisa," Victoria said, though her eyes remained like flint. "But the old money lifestyle is officially over. The auditors will be at your house by noon to begin the asset recovery. I'd suggest you start packing. You don't own the furniture, the cars, or the house. I do." Victoria didn't wait for the screaming to start. She didn't wait to see Brandon being led out in front of the cameras that were already gathering at the entrance. She turned her back on the wreckage of the family that had tried to bury her, her heels striking the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown, finally reaching 0. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool evening air, she felt the weight of years of gaslighting and theft slide off her shoulders. She had a new life to start, and for the first time in a long time, the only name on the door would be hers. Behind her, the lobby was a sea of shouting voices and flashbulbs, but Victoria didn't look back. She had an appointment with a locksmith, and she intended to be there when the first bolt turned. 6 months had passed since the bishop name was dragged through the mud of the public square, and the silence that followed was the most expensive thing Victoria had ever bought. In the high-ceilinged sanctuary of her new architectural firm, the air smelled of fresh vellum, expensive roast coffee, and the faint, ozone tang of a city recovering from a summer storm. There were no shouting voices here, no cameras, and no one demanding she apologize for her own existence. Victoria Bishop stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching the sunset bleed crimson over the skyline she was currently redesigning. Her hands, once prone to trembling under the weight of gaslighting, were perfectly still as she smoothed the edge of a blueprint. The paper felt crisp and substantial, a physical manifestation of a life built on solid ground rather than the shifting sands of Brandon's lies. A soft chime announced a visitor before Marcus Thorne stepped into the room. He didn't carry the heavy litigation folders anymore. Today, he held a single, slender envelope and 2 glasses of sparkling water. He looked around the sleek, minimalist space, his eyes lingering on the awards already lining the mahogany shelves. "The final liquidation is complete," Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly against the polished concrete floors. He handed her the envelope. "The estate is officially off the books. Every cent of the recovered embezzled funds has been moved into your primary development account. You're clear, Victoria, in every sense of the word." She took the envelope, the weight of it surprisingly light considering it represented the total annihilation of her former life. And the others. Marcus took a slow sip of his water, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. Brandon Bishop is no longer a brand ambassador for anything more prestigious than a suburban car wash. I checked the filings this morning. He's living in a 40-year-old studio apartment in the industrial district. No gym, no concierge, and certainly no vintage wine cellar. He tried to file for a name change last week, but the creditors blocked it. They want every person he owes to know exactly who he is. Victoria turned back to the window. She could almost picture him there, his designer suits replaced by cheap polyester, his charismatic smile curdling into a permanent scowl of resentment. The face slap of the public reveal had been a momentary explosion, but this, the slow, grinding reality of being ordinary and broke, was the true punishment for a man who believed he was a god. "And Lisa Bishop?" she asked, her voice cool. Lisa is currently residing in a small rental in the suburbs, Marcus replied. She's been seen at various consignment shops trying to sell off the jewelry you didn't reclaim. The problem is, once the old money crowd found out the Bishop fortune was built on your stolen intellectual property and bank fraud, they closed their doors. She's a social pariah. I hear she spends most of her time writing letters to editors that no one will ever publish. The image of Lisa, the woman who had used Victoria's talent to buy her way into high society, now haggling over the price of a used brooch, brought a flicker of cold satisfaction to Victoria's chest. It was proportional. Lisa had valued status over blood, and now she had neither. Isabella Martinez had fared no better. She had fled the state the moment the FBI started asking questions about the art consultancy, leaving Brandon to face the auditors alone. She was currently being sued in absentia for every penny she'd spent on Brandon's dime. He sent another letter, Marcus added, pulling a crumpled piece of notebook paper from his pocket. He's asking for a meeting. He says he's changed. He wants to discuss a consulting role in your new firm. Victoria didn't smile. She didn't even reach for the paper. Burn it, Marcus. I don't hire ghosts. She walked over to her desk, the heels of her shoes clicking with a sharp, rhythmic finality. She sat down and looked at the blueprint of the new Bishop Plaza, a building that would be hers alone, designed by her hand, funded by her success. Yet, as she looked at the empty chair across from her, a sudden, sharp ache bloomed in her chest. She had won. She had the money, the reputation, and the power. But the cost was written in the quiet of the room. She had lost the capacity to trust blindly. She looked at Marcus, her most loyal ally, and wondered if she would ever truly believe in a friendship that wasn't reinforced by a retainer fee. The family she had tried to love was a charred ruin, and while she had been the one to light the match, the smoke still clung to her clothes. "Is that all?" she asked, her tone shifting back to professional steel. "One last thing," Marcus said, pausing at the door. "The locksmith finished the final change on the old estate, the one you're turning into the foundation for the arts. He found something in the floorboards of Brandon's old office, a small box." He placed a tiny wooden box on her desk. Inside was a single chipped marble, a toy she had given Brandon when they were children, back when she thought he was her protector. Victoria stared at the marble for a long moment. It was a relic of a girl who no longer existed, a girl who had been buried under years of theft and arrogance. She picked it up, feeling the cold, smooth surface against her palm, then walked to the wastebasket and let it go. The sound of it hitting the bottom was small, but final. "The blueprint is finished," she whispered to the empty office. She picked up her pen, her eyes fixed on the future she had carved out of the wreckage. The past was a debt paid in full. She turned off the lamp, leaving the room in shadows, and walked out into the bright, unforgiving lights of the city she now owned.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.